Rebecca, welcome. Thank you so much for taking your time to do this. I want to start right away by asking you, what is the Gilded Age? How did it come to be called this? What moved you to write a book about it?
So I might actually start by borrowing. I had the pleasure last week of meeting Nate McAllister, who was the Gilder Lehrman Teacher of the Year in 2010. And the way he does this is he asks his students to bring from home something that has no value, and they're not going to get it back. And then he takes all of those items that they brought in and he puts them in two groups and he spray paints one half of them gold with gold spray paint, right? And then he lets it dry and then he gives them back. And he says, okay, did I make your object more valuable, your rock or your paper clip or whatever it is that people brought in? And they look at it and say, no, not really. It's still the same valueless thing before. So that's kind of a nice way of thinking about the Gilded Age, that when Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner wrote the novel, they wanted to say, look, America glitters on the outside, but underneath, if you scrape off that gilding, it's very thin, and really this era is a period of corruption and malaise. In some ways, that's a key theme in all of American history, right? When does it happen when someone says America is a great place? Or, Jefferson says all men are created equal and he's owning slaves. And, in all periods of American history, you can look at those places where there's a gap between the promise or the hope or the ideals and the reality. For some reason, that particular theme gets particularly concentrated on this era. Right? It's kind of the dumping ground. And I guess that's the answer to your second question, is that this is sort of an underdog era in the textbooks. It's often described as an era of stagnation and malaise and corruption. There's always a giant cartoon of Boss Tweed, right? Yeah. And I don't think people really want to read that chapter. That is a very, very tough sell. And I think that's a misconception of the period, because at the time, people definitely didn't think they were living in a Gilded Age.
Sure.
That term got used really in the 1920s. Alan Lessoff has done some work showing how, looking back, people said, oh, well, we didn't really have our values in the right place at that time. But at the time, you have immigrants, you have African Americans after emancipation, you have women taking on all these new public roles, you have farm boys moving into the city, you've got working class people trying to get an education. They all see it as an era of progress and promise. Wow, we had a great war, we preserved the Union, we ended, we brought about emancipation. The economy is growing. This is the period where in Pittsburgh, the fact that you can't breathe is a really good sign, right? That means there's jobs. That means that the factories are humming and that people are getting work.
Like China today.
Exactly. Very much like China today. So they don't see it in the way that maybe we look back and see it. And I wanted to capture some of that because I think that gives us a more complex view of the era.
Oh, that's fabulous, because you've already, just in a couple of sentences, energized that period imaginatively with all of these human activities and developments. So as in every period of history, there are countless individual stories, and you have many of them in your book. What are two or three of the individual stories, whether high or low, that are most important to you, most interesting to you?
Well, one person that I've always admired greatly is Jane Addams, and she gets put in the Progressive era, but she really founded Hull House in 1889, so I sort of claimed her a little bit, right? For some reason, the populists always get put in they started when the Populist Party is founded in 1890. They get put in the chapter about stagnation and malaise and the farmer's last stand and backward-looking agrarians. And Jane Addams gets put in the forward-looking chapter. But they're really happening at the same time. And in fact, Jane Addams was very well aware of the People's Party's rise in Chicago and was very active in left politics in Chicago. So she's a favorite of mine. But then a lot of the people I've sort of met for this book were people who inspired me for other reasons. Immigrants, the 12-year-old boy in Greece whose village looks around and says, you're really promising and really smart, so we're going to send you to the United States, and we're going to get you a ticket, and then we expect you to be a success. We expect you to write home. We expect you to be the person who provides the link for other people who want to come later. You're going to go figure it out for us. And wow, 12 years old, right? And then there was a Lakota boy who says he went to boarding school from the Lakota reservation, and he couldn't imagine, he said, what white people would want with a Lakota child other than to kill them. And so he assumed he was going to die. So that's how he went to boarding school. He said, war isn't open. I can't prove my manhood. I can't prove myself on the battlefield anymore. We are now forbidden from taking that path. So this is how I'll prove myself. I'll go east and I'll die. And they'll know I died bravely. Wow, what a way to get off the train and go to boarding school, right? And I think the other person that really, whose story just amazed me was this woman who was sold into slavery in China. She came as a child to the United States and was sold into prostitution. She married one of her clients who they saved their money and they married, and it was a sort of happy ending, and then her husband died after 2 years and she went back into prostitution. So she tells this story. Judy Young found this story, an interview with this woman. She went back to China, to the town that she had come from. She didn't try to contact her parents or her family at all. She said they wouldn't want to know me. No, they sold me away and they don't want to know who I am. But she found a baby girl that had been left to die. And she took that baby back with her to the United States and said, okay, she's going to be the American that I didn't get to be. She said, if I were younger, if I'd had another experience, I would be an American. But I never quite got to be an American. But there's something so moving about that. First of all, just that kind of oppression that she suffered and what she endured, and then also that sort of continued tenacity and hope, that,
yes.
Okay, this didn't work for me, but I'm going to make it happen for another baby girl. And she had a sister who had been exposed and left to die because the family was just desperately poor. And so this kind of became the next generation that she brought her back and raised her. And she said she'll never be a prostitute. She's going to get an education. She's going to be a respectable woman, and she's going to kind of become an American in my place, because I was never able to do that.
Somewhere in there, there's an ideal of America.
Absolutely.
That persists, that keeps people going.
Absolutely, absolutely. And people who just endured unbelievable things. And I think sometimes people tell these as stories about the history of immigration or the Native American history or African American history, but I wanted to try to put them all together. I sort of imagined the little kid from Greece on a train headed west to Chicago, and the guy from the Lakota reservation is going east at the same time, and they're passing, all of these stories.
And the girl from Asia,
absolutely,
from China, coming
absolutely.
back and forth.
Well, and the other interesting thing is that, supposedly this is during Chinese exclusion. In theory, she's not supposed to be able to get in and out of the United States. Well, that tells you how well America's immigration exclusion has worked, right? She went back to Hong Kong, she said 4 times. So she was in and out. She knew how to get in and out.
Fascinating.
So highly mobile, very young, lots and lots of young people, lots of children and young people in these stories that really moved me, and that's really why I wanted to tell their stories.
Rebecca, I love this. And we have some questions from a couple of schools, but I first want to just ask you one other thing. For students out here who are watching this discussion, are there still stories like this to be found? I mean, sometimes students feel everything's been discovered, the story's all known, history's all set. There's nothing for me to do. There's nowhere to go that's really new. But are there life stories out there for students today to discover and bring to the fore?
Oh, absolutely. I know that feeling, because the first time I ever went to an Organization of American Historians meeting, I had just gone to graduate school, and I went to the conference and I looked around at all the publishers and all the history books, and I thought, there's nothing left to say, right? Nothing can be, nothing. How could you possibly find another topic?
Guess what?
Everything's been written.
Then this came.
There are always new stories. And there's really exciting fields out there on the history of, say, sexuality. History of gay and lesbian history is a totally new field, right? And California has now said, we need to teach this. We need to make it visible. So there's lots of teachers in California saying, okay, how do we kind of render that history visible? And there's a task that we all have before us to make that history visible. I think Native American history is understudied. There are a lot of fields like that. Environmental history is a new field. So you can even not only identify new stories, but whole new fields that emerge as people begin to see history in new ways.
We're going to circle back to that sexuality subject because there's a chapter entitled Sex here in your book, which is fabulous. But I want to get to a couple of the schools who have sent questions in advance. And one of them comes from Gloria Sesso, a history teacher out on Long Island in the Patchogue Medford district. And her question is about 2 terms applied to this era often. Can you tell us about the difference between or the overlap of the progressive era on the one hand and the Gilded Age on the other?
Oh, that's a great question. So if there's anything I would like to sort of convey to teachers and students is that these kind of labels are not facts, right? They're interpretations. And I think that the idea of a Gilded Age, which I'll put in little quotation marks, right, and the idea of a progressive era are ripe for challenge. Right? First of all, how do you explain to students that something called the progressive era happens right as the Supreme Court passes Plessy v. Ferguson, right? And right as disfranchisement comes in, and right as the U.S. decides to go and claim the Philippines, right? And fights a big war of conquest, really, in the Philippines. So progressive has to go in quotation marks, right? And Gilded, for other reasons, as I've already suggested, has to go in quotation marks. I think there are continuities. There are a lot of continuities, and in fact, in the textbook that I've written for Bedford St. Martin's America's History, I tried to create one chapter called Whose Government? Populists, Progressives, and Politics, 1880 to 1917, and give people a way of thinking about this as one era. That's also an interpretation, right? There are other historians who would say, no, the Gilded Age, there's a sharp break between the Gilded Age and the Progressive era.
And through it all, some would say the Jim Crow era.
Absolutely.
That's another narrative structure.
Although, Jim Crow really doesn't fully come about till about 1900. If you look at, say, railroad segregation, there's a huge struggle in the 1870s and 1880s. African Americans are still voting in very large numbers in, say, North Carolina as late as 1898. The last African American congressman, who has the ironic name of George White, he leaves Congress in 1901, and he gives this amazing speech in which he says, okay, this is the end of African American participation in Congress. But there will be another era. I'm walking out, and this is going to be an all-white Congress, but you'll see that change. It will happen. We just have to wait. It was an amazing, amazing speech. So, so it's really, there's some ways in which the earlier period is more vibrant. Agrarian and farmer labor protests is very big in the 1880s. The Women's Christian Temperance Union peaks in the 1880s. So there's certain reform movements that peak earlier. And then, of course, say, Eugene Debs doesn't found the Socialist Party until later. So it's a nice exercise. I think it would be cool to get students to say, okay, divide them in groups. Call it the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era, or give it a new name, right?
What's the new name, right?
Yeah.
Or make the case. But competing narratives. And in a way, you make it clear as you say that. There's so much going on here. There's so many different strands of seething energy happening that it's hard to have a simple label for the whole of it.
And if you can tease out threads, labor has a really tough time in the 1880s and 1890s. The climate is just very hostile. And then later on, say during the Wilson administration, there are some substantial gains that are beginning to kind of look toward the New Deal. So if you want to if you're looking at a labor story, the Gilded Age followed by a progressive era that's looking toward the New Deal makes sense. If you're looking at African American history, I think probably that same trajectory doesn't quite make sense.
Very interesting. I want to move to another question that's actually picking up on that, the labor and capital discussion, from a teacher called Alice Lesh, who's at the West Hill School in Stamford, Connecticut. Cool. And she gives us a couple of titles and says, of these business leaders, is it more appropriate to call them captains of industry or robber barons?
Oh. That's a really good question. I confess to having robber baron leanings, right? I mean, Richard White's new book, Railroader, there's a lot of work out there that really does emphasize, these were not good guys. I think that Americans as a whole tend to call them captains of industry when we're in a period of great prosperity and, Silicon Valley is taking off, or we're having some great business boom, and then we think business is great. And whenever we have a big recession or depression or massive downturn, then we say it's all the robber baron's fault, right? Sort of ignoring the fact that everybody gave the robber barons room to do what they were doing while they were doing it, right? So it changes. One of the metaphors I like for this period is a football metaphor. At the time, there just weren't, all the rules for football had not been worked out yet. It was it was a blood sport, right? People died on the football field in this period, and they didn't want any regulation or any rules that would prevent that, because they said this is a place where manhood is cultivated on the sports field. Well, people did things that were clearly not okay. Like there was one team that sewed a handle on the back of their quarterback's uniform, so two guys could pick him up and just throw him over the line. Well, you can see, putting a handle on your quarterback, that's probably just not okay. But there was no rule against it, right? So people did it, and then you had to go and write a rule saying you cannot sew a handle on your quarterback's uniform, right? I mean, because no one had thought about it. And the industrialists are very much the same way, I think. They were doing things that you could look and say, It's not really, but there wasn't a law. And so you have this long sort of Wild West period of industrialization. One of the things I liked writing about was that it was the same actually in paleontology. There was this huge sort of race to identify dinosaurs and claim conquest between these two guys, Othniel Marsh at Yale and his big rival Edward Cope. And then there were these people who said in the next generation, we spent our whole lives cleaning up the mess that those two guys left behind. Because they had this big rivalry and they just all wanted to name the largest, and they both wanted to name all the dinosaurs. And then they just left a mess. And I think that's probably, well, in the football, eventually they started regulating football as a live issue now, right? How much violence is okay on the football field? How much damage should the players take? And where should you say that's not okay?
But interestingly, to pursue your metaphor, football has gone from a sort of, small group sport, hardly known, to a major universal sport at every level, and now a major business in the public sphere.
Absolutely. Well, and the sports are also big enterprises, right? I mean, the baseball league was one of the great monopolies, right?
Yes.
And for the struggle of the players to get free agency was a great labor struggle. So you can see when you think about, we tend to think about industrialization in this very narrow way, like it was just the steel industry.
Just factories,
but it's, Hearst's newspapers and mass media, and it's sports and all kinds of businesses. The Ladies' Home Journal manages to be the first magazine that has 1 million subscribers. So business looks like a lot of different things, and enterprise, I mean, the economy is being transformed in a way that I think goes beyond just sort of industrialization in a factory sense.
So let's pick up on that, because there are, in the back of your book, there are a few very interesting, provocative questions that have been applied to your work, and one of them has to do with that idea of creative destruction that I think Joseph Schumpeter famously described capitalism as being creative destruction. That has a lot of implications for labor, for different businesses, for a certain element of creativity, but also for negative pressures on many people's lives. Could you say a little bit about how apt that idea is of creative destruction and whether it is legitimately the dynamic of this period? Well,
I mean, it's a very interesting question, and it sort of goes back to that great question about the robber barons and the industrial titans, right? The nice thing about the term is it has creative and it has destruction, right? And you could spill, people have spilled thousands and thousands of pages of ink over, are you going to emphasize the creative or are you going to emphasize the destruction? Capitalism wreaks havoc in this period on people's bodies, on the environment. It's a very destructive force in a lot of ways. It would also be wrong not to point out that women's rights, to some degree in the 19th century, are a product of that same process of capitalist transformation, that Married Women's Property Act, women's entry into the paid workforce, often in a very disadvantageous ways. But there are many ways in which women's rights are advanced by the same individualism, the idea that each person in the marketplace is going to be an individual. Elizabeth Cady Stanton has an amazing speech called The Solitude of Self, in which she says, you know what? Every one of us is out there, and the storms of life are beating on us, and you can't say that women are sheltered, you can't say that women are protected, because they're not. And in fact, men are better able to protect themselves because they're taught that they're going to have to protect themselves, whereas women are told, don't worry, you'll be protected, your husband, your father will take care of you. And then it turns out that's not true for millions of women. And so the problem that she's describing was created by capitalism to a large degree, but also it creates the space in which she can make a women's rights argument. Look, women have to have the same individual rights that men do. He takes all of those items that they brought in and he puts them in two groups, and he spray paints one half of them gold, with gold spray paint, right? And then he lets it dry, and then he gives them back. And he says, okay, did I make your object more valuable, your rock or your paper clip or whatever it is that people brought in? And they look at it and say, no, not really. It's still the same valueless thing before. So that's kind of a nice way of thinking about the Gilded Age, that when Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner wrote this, and in all periods of American history, you can look at those places where there's a gap between the promise or the hope or the ideals and the reality. For some reason, that particular theme gets particularly concentrated on this era, right? It's kind of the dumping ground. And I guess that's the answer to your second question, is that this is sort of an underdog era in the textbooks. It's often described as an era of stagnation and malaise and corruption. There's always a giant...
Rebecca, welcome. Thank you so much for taking your time to do this. I want to start right away by asking you What is the Gilded Age? How did it come to be called this? What moved you to write a book about it?
So I might actually start by borrowing. I had the pleasure last week of meeting Nate McAllister, who was the Gilded Learman Teacher of the Year in 2010. And the way he does this is he asks his students to bring from home something that has no value, and they're not going to get it back. And then the novel, they wanted to say, look, America glitters on the outside, but underneath, if you scrape off that gilding, it's very thin, and really this era is a period of corruption and malaise. In some ways, that's a key theme in all of American history, right? When does it happen when someone says America is a great place? Or, Jefferson says all men are created equal and he's owning slaves. Cartoon of Boss Tweed, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think people really want to read that chapter. That is a very, very tough sell. And I think that's a misconception of the period because at the time, people definitely didn't think they were living in a Gilded Age.
Sure.
That term got used really in the 1920s. Alan Lessoff has done some work showing how, looking back, people said, oh, well, we didn't really have our values in the right place at that time.